learned a lot more about open in the friction of trying to explain it to enterprise architects, to people who are delivering products and services, to policy friends, and those little fires, like I would share, I figure out what the topic was, the person, I would start sharing articles. Here's a video, and like what's going to work with them, right? But they have taught me more about trying to work in the open and how hard it is and how beautiful it can be, right? And I think that being open to the fact that the principles will change, you can help change an organization, but be aware that it's going to change who you are and how you work, right? And that you have to really own the fact that maybe you're not working as open as you could be, right? Like maybe there are other reasons why. Is it the institution? Is it you? Is it the dynamics? Is it the culture differences? Like there's all reasons why it doesn't necessarily land quite well yet. You got it? So I'm Heather Leson, Digital Innovation Lead at Solferino Academy IFRC. We're the International Federation for Crossword Crescent Societies. We work with 192 national societies around the world in a federated model. Each national society has its own special flower. So it's not like you can make one plan and it'll work for everything. It's all in negotiation. It's all in adaptability. So I think what's really interesting is coming from working in open source and working in open data is that I already have those hooks of understanding, oh, well, you need to go read something that Deb Bryant did, or what did Dave Nearly put up, right? Or what's going on at OSI. Like I already understand that space and know where to fish and find details. But I think if you're trying to transform your organization and try and understand how do you do that in an open way, in a transformative way, using open principles and or even open source or open data, where do you start? Like, I don't think there's a guidebook for where you start. Maybe that's our next book, guys.
Yeah. I also come from a background of open source. When I got in, I worked at the Mozilla Foundation, which is a nonprofit, but they are a tech nonprofit and tech activism, and they're also an open organization. So, I kind of don't count the Mozilla Foundation as a nonprofit, although it technically is, because they were already involved in the open space. But coming to Greenpeace, who I've been working with for 6 years now, Greenpeace didn't have any sort of connection point to the world of open source before I started working with them, and I think for me, I think it's really important that people from open source are actually connecting with nonprofits. I do think that we have gotten to a point where we've created enough bridges between open source and nonprofits that it's starting to get easier to help people find where to start, or for people to get started on their own. Right. Because, we've, even in the Open Org project, we've written so much about nonprofit and open source, like the space between those two things, that if you were to Google it, open source and nonprofit, then likely you're going to find some of this work. And so I don't think it's as bad, as hard to get started as it was 10 years ago. But I do think that for people who are sort of looking around, it's hard to know what to do first. And maybe that's something that we would be able to help with.
Yeah. And I think the where to start, and I said the buddy system, because I think like I knew who to call and to ask questions about, right? Mm-hmm. When I started at IFRC, which is almost 4.6 years ago, there was no digital strategy, there was no data protection policy, there was no mapping of all the open source and open data projects. Things were happening in silos in different sectors, and again, across the world, there's 13.7 million volunteers and like 500,000 staff, and you never know what's happening anywhere, right? Welcome to the globe. But yeah, at the same time, you started to find your early actors, and I kind of put a 5-point plan together. So there's the who can I talk to internally who is working on it or who is close to buying in. So who's doing what, right? Like a three in humanitarian space, we call it a 3W, right? Who's doing what, mm-hmm. and what, where. And so in the second thing is that who is doing things externally that is already partnering with us. And then by having that mapping, you start to think about like, how do we work, and what do we need to change? And so my colleague from a partner, she likes to call it setting little fires. So I ran the first open data day that ever happened at the Red Cross Red Crescent in our head office. And I just decided that we're going to do this and this is how we're going to do it. And then we had a Center for Humanitarian Data, which does open data, come and present. We had people who are already working on Open Data Kit, which is an open source project, of course. And then people who are working on a new platform called the Go platform, which is also open source. So we gave it a space. I created space for people to come and meet their allies internally. So I think setting up an informal group and a meeting to say, hey, who's doing what, and then start to map what's happening around the world, that was really helpful. So now we have this corpus of people and a global strategy, which includes open source and open principles, but that took a lot of heavy lifting and negotiating to get there. But by collecting insights and examples and always be charging and always running meetings and always having demonstrations and always pushing it and pushing blog posts, etc., by being so noisy, and also, again, not from a secretariat point of view, but there's an amazing Open Data Kit team that's been working in Kobo teams that have been working in Burundi and in Turkey, right? There's incredible people around the world who've been thinking about open source and open data for a long time. The Asia Pacific office has been doing Sahana and RMS for a long time, right? So when I found that out, I was like, okay, I was having trouble figuring out who to talk to in the Asia Pacific office. And so now I know, right? So finding the allies and finding out how to be a supporting person. We actually started a how to talk about open in the office document, a Q&A. Here's some examples and here's the talking points. So I just culled from what everybody else had and then married it to Red Cross examples, because in my organization, they want to know, how does it matter to our mission, to the work that we're doing, but also is there something that's already happened or is it brand new? Do we have to start over, right? And so I always like to show external examples from other humanitarian organizations or development, but they did appreciate it and move farther by having those internal examples. And then I just mapped the principles together and started to talk and put it into the verbiage and write the talking points for leaders to say, hey, we're already doing this, right? So if you start to assume, you have to negotiate, but then if you can align it to what they think and what they matter, then you can make a win. What was your experience, Laura?
Yeah, I think, well, I was just going to attach onto the internal allies thing, because I think that if you're just getting started and trying to figure out how you can embed open principles into your nonprofit organization, then step number one is find your allies. Because it was the same experience at Greenpeace. I was brought into Greenpeace because of my background in open source, and my line manager at the time knew, he's part of the senior leadership team, and he knew that there was something about open source, but he didn't know anything about it. And so when I went to have a chat with him and to hear about what it was that Greenpeace was trying to do, he saw that I have a reputation in open source, and he was like, we need somebody inside of the organization who can lead this work and push this open thing forward. And at that time, it wasn't even open source technology. It was just that word open. And when I started to actually just do the work in an open way, that was really quite revolutionary for them to like, here's somebody coming in who is openly blogging about their work, openly talking about the issues that they're facing, reflecting, inviting people to community calls. Like, I kicked off a community call within my second week of being with Greenpeace, and just like living the behavior was kind of the beginning. And then I started to find allies for people who were attracted to this way of working. And together we essentially convinced Greenpeace to make the platform Planet 4 completely open sourced, to run it as an open project, which had an internal team. So this strategy was really a bit like, have you heard of 18F?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah. So this was actually a really similar strategy. They also found a team of internal staff that were going to be taking over a particular piece of a digital platform, and use that as sort of a Trojan horse for instilling open principles at a wider, in concentric circles outward. And that's exactly what we did at Greenpeace. The Planet 4 project is an open source piece of software. The team works openly. There are, community contributions, and it started as open internally, where all of the engagement work that we were doing was to other Greenpeace staff, and not just at Greenpeace International, but on all of the national and regional offices. And that project provided a frame for us to, actually behave openly, model the behavior. And little by little, that just what that small team was doing, that little fire started to catch fires in other places. And so now, that team is still working openly. They're still building the platform, that we kicked off a number of years ago. They have the principles of openness have spread into other departments, and it has been quite organic growth inside of Greenpeace as a global network of organizations. And then what's really interesting is that it started to bleed outwards, right? Mm-hmm. So it was intentionally inwards in the beginning, because part of what we were trying to do was digital transformation inside of Greenpeace, right? Like, how can Greenpeace work together more openly? How can they be more collaborative? And sort of breaking down some of the silos that you were talking about. And now it's expanded outwards, because the product that we were building was open source, and we did quite a bit of external to the tech industry outreach, and said, hey, you know what, open sourcers out there in the world, nonprofits are doing really important things. They need tech help too. And if you contribute to this open source project, you're supporting this kind of a mission. And I think that has been a powerful message between, from the open source world to the open tech world. Like, you have skills that are needed in the humanitarian space, that are needed in the environmental space. Like, these organizations are fighting for our people and our planet. Your skills can help them. And that kind of that storyline has been actually quite effective. And it's been the same in COVID, right? A lot of tech around COVID is also built open source technology. Like in Germany, the Corona warning app is open source, and they did that because it's more secure. There's a lot of people that want to contribute to making sure that the software that holds your vaccination is functions, is secure, is good. And that's places where tech activism, like the tech activism background, and then the humanitarian coming together is kind of doing some big stuff.
One thing that you really leaned into, or really kind of hyperstate, was it's a lot of community engagement, right? And what I really took from the last 5 years of working on this is kind of two or three things. There were already beautiful people doing this work. It's about shining a light on them and giving them the support. And also, I did spend a lot of time on the strategy team to put it into the strategy, so that they have something they can build on and use it as hey, this is an official document approved by our governing board. And that's really important in some very traditional organizations to shift. But there's also things like missing maps. And I really like missing maps and humanitarian OpenStreetMap, and OpenStreetMap is kind of my volunteer home. And State of the Map this weekend, so a big mapping conference of people from around the world. I'm very excited to go and listen to what people have to work on. But missing maps is really about solving that problem with communities at a very local level. Yes, you can have remote volunteers, but how can we have disaster responders in communities working, who understand the kind of theory and the needs and the logistics of it, work with GIS students, work with local communities to be able to solve problems together. And so that kind of open collaboration around what HOTS put together and what missing maps can do, I see so much potential for what volunteers can be. And I like to call it digital first aid. Now I changed my whole career from working in tech and OpenStax to working in humanitarian and research and social entrepreneurship, because I couldn't believe that our volunteer skills could actually have an impact in the world in this way. And I think that those pipelines for doing that is really important to get towards. So one, shining a light on where it exists, and then trying to link it to your traditional types of work, plus kind of the new ways of working. When it comes to working in the open, to come back to the other principle around collaboration, with the data playbook, which was something, when I got to the Red Cross, Red Crescent, they said, oh, create an AI product. or let's research how AI can work. And so I said, wait, whoa, let's just let me just spend some time getting to know you guys. Like, and so I had a very angry, lovely angry health person come and talk to me about a really kind of dicey technical problem she had. And I realized that people are scared of data and technology a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And open source and open technology, very nervous, right? And it's because it's not necessarily, they haven't really transformed in terms of how they work. So how do you not retrofit it, but make it their idea? So instead of creating the data product, what I did was figure out what people were working on. I just lost my headphones, sorry, I had to switch. Always have spare headphones, I'm telling you, always be prepared. So the thing that I did was find out what people were already working on, and then try and put them in the same room. When you put people in the same room and you say, oh, well, you already know this, let's just see how we can tweak it to fit your purposes. That's open collaboration. So building on existing knowledge and existing skills, that to me is the most important thing that we can do. And so the playbook, we made it Creative Commons. We put it out there in the ether. I did this with hundreds of people across the Red Cross with our beta version. I did it openly. I invited, apparently I was the only person who had ever sent an all staff meeting for a data meeting, and I invited everybody from HR to finance to all the data nerdia. And they're like, we've never been in the same room together. What does this happen? What do you mean we're going to create it together? I'm like, well, we're going to figure it out. Let's figure it out, right? And so by working in the open, as you said, Laura, I think it's really important to be the example, and also to have some group therapy on the side, like open organization group therapy, writing the strategy. Thank you. You might not have known that, but I was just like, okay, this isn't working. I'm going to go let's see if I can negotiate here. And so, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's really fantastic. But the thing that happened with the playbook, which I'm really excited about, we're doing version 1 right now. We have far more people involved. So teaching a collaborative process, but making it so that everyone can shape it in an open way, in a participatory way. That's where the magic is with community. And so by working in the open and trying to do that, we never expected the Red Cross, Red Crescent, that the playbook would be used by other humanitarian organizations. UNHCR uses it, ICRC uses it, Mercy uses it. They weren't our audience, but we were very excited to hear that they found it useful, right? And I think you have to take a leap sometimes, and most people are choosing branding over mission. And I think this is what open lets us do, is say, well, there's only a little bit of money around. Let's see what we can collaborate on. And so, yes, of course, I have this audience and I have to serve it. But if it's going to help another group solve a humanitarian or development issue, hooray.
I went to, I was going to latch on to something that you said about, like, when you're talking about frontline volunteers and local communities and volunteers. I think that it's important to make the point that open principles are not just for digital activists. Open source is, when we talk about open source, when we talk about open principle, we don't just mean in the technology space. And that was one of the things, that was really awesome about the experience at Greenpeace was, as we modeled the behavior internally and as we used typical open methodologies that I learned in the tech industry, or that we saw in use in other places, those things started to spread out into campaigns, into the program team, where people are actually planning what are the actions that are going to be happening to save this or that forest, or if we have some sort of an ocean theme, that the teams themselves, regardless of whether they have anything to do with technology products, started to use open principles in their planning processes, in their engagement with volunteer. And so I wouldn't ever deign to say that the whole organization is open. I think that continuum is a big sliding scale, but there are allies within who have changed their ways of working to be more open and more inclusive of the communities that they're actually working with, because they were able to see how it's not scary to, for example, publish your ideas before you've had the 17th pass or whatever. And I think, and that's also something that's been a big part of the work that we've done with the Catalyst Network, which is it's a funding network that's funding somewhere just over 200 charities in the UK. with some digital partners who are helping people learn about openness and go through digital transformation, not just people, but charities. And that was, that was also one of the big learnings for me in running some of those programs, is a lot of the help that people need, or it doesn't have anything to do with, knowing how to comment code or figuring out how to make your data secure while keeping it open, or some of these slightly more technical versions of open. A lot of it has to do with simple, like open leadership traits and behaviors, and also giving confidence. So what you said earlier about shining a light on the communities that are making this stuff happen and on the allies that are out there, a lot of it is about the people like the Open Org ambassadors who are out there working every day to help people feel more confident in using these kinds of quote unquote new methodologies, open practices in their everyday lives, and to understand that we're not really raised or conditioned to feel that some of these behaviors are normal. Like, I mean, we're still, especially in the Western world, still very conditioned to see a career ladder and to be pushed by our ego and ambition. And, the thing about open principles is that, like, a leader in the open space is really constantly checking in with their own ego and checking on, am I doing this because it's right for the community and it's right for the project and it's right for the organization, or am I doing this because, my ego is kind of driving me? And that kind of self-reflective check is not very natural. I think it's just something you kind of have to pay attention to. And I think that those kinds of lessons are also really important for nonprofits, because it's everybody who works in a nonprofit, they're not doing it for the fame and fortune. They're doing it because they believe in the mission, right? Yeah. And part of that is trying to be the best activist that you can be. And so some of the things that come out of open principles, I think, are really about the human, we're going to talk about human beings a bit.
Yeah, no, I think, human beings, and I think, again, so the Red Cross, Red Crescent, we're kind of driven by these fundamental principles, right? And so I map those to the open principles, but I'm not the first person who's done this. There's a woman or a man named Charmindra Silva, who was involved in the Sahana project many years ago in 2010, wrote an article for TIM, which is a technology innovation review magazine. And I held on to that article. I held on to it before I found you guys. I was like, this helps me to talk with humanitarians, because it's not new, right? The principles of how we're working, we just need to, in some ways, yes, it's maybe a new framing, and open org is new framing, but these are not new values. This is the community center. This is how people, like when I was growing up, where if somebody had a fire, and I grew up in Northern Canada, there was a quilting party, there was a making party, people went and built their house. It is the same kind of principles of communities taking care of communities in a digital way, or maybe just in an open way. And I think you're right to divorce the digital from it, because I think I've seen time and time again some really great practices of policy documents that have tried to work in a collaborative way, in an open way in my organization. And it's been really exciting to say, well, you kind of are following open principles. Well, what are you talking about, Heather? This is how we work. And well, let's walk through this, right? And so they can see the alignment, but sometimes you don't need to name it as open principles. You just need to kind of show how that there's some tools out there that can help them continue to have success in the way that they're working. And I think this transformation around how we work, and for us, there's a lot of tension right now in humanitarian organizations around, are we working local enough, right? Where is the funding going? Is it really going to local communities? And, there's a whole thing around transparency with the IATI, if you're familiar with IATI, which is the International Aid Transparency Index. That's really hard to show the transparency of where money goes. There's the Grand Bargain, which talks about the participatory revolution and localization. All of these are nice theories and practices. Some of them are happening, some of them are not. But what really struck me was yesterday I was reading the article by Hugo Slim, who's quite a thought leader in the humanitarian space. And he was talking about localization of work we're not talking about localization of data centers. I know that's a whole separate topic, but how humanitarian work is happening by local communities and small NGOs, why it relates to self-determination, why it relates to respectability, and why it relates to our principles. And it's an amazing article. I'll share it with you.
Thank you. I was just going to ask.
Yeah. And I came out of that article reading it going, localization is open principles, right? Collaborate, work with our communities, be transparent, be adaptable. Like it can apply to something that's been a long-term thing. So the argument could flow that by localizing, right, by focusing on a localized agenda, we need to think about how that fits into local cultures and local communities. So there's no one way to do open, and we all know this, right? I think it's super clear to check our privilege here, because what happens with open source or open anything in Japan is going to be structurally different because of the culture and the contracts, right? What happens in Indonesia, there's amazing open source stuff happening there, open principle stuff happening there. But they might not necessarily call it open source and open principles, right? And they might not necessarily have all the things that traditionally people would think of as an open community, but they have a lot of the attributes of open principles, right? So I think our definition of open shifts a little bit, but that means that we need to be flexible in the fact that people have a different open journey. Like mine started in 1991, right? I had Freenet account. Like I've always been working with open source software, and many people have, but everybody's open journey is different, right? And how they come and they interact with the principles, or how they enact it and discover it and how they apply it. I think there's lots to be learning from it. A couple of years ago, I did an analysis with OpenStreetMap to see how the open principles aligned with how OpenStreetMap was governed. I didn't make a lot of friends sometimes because I said that we're not open enough. And that's because of diversity and inclusion, right? And so I'm like, well, if you start to apply diversity, inclusion plus open, well, are we really there yet? And so everyone's got work to do. Us as individuals trying to be open leaders, but also organizations. And it's just fun to meet other people who are trying, right?
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. And no, I really identify with what you were just saying about the semantics of open, because I've long been, I'm a writer too. So I'm really interested in how we use different words to say the same thing. And that's definitely something that, I mean, maybe because I am a writer and I love to read, maybe that's part of why I've found it easier to translate open principles into nonprofit space. But I've definitely seen, even just in the past 6 months, heard and seen people having conversations about how, especially the tech industry is constantly jargon bombing. And I think that is a real danger when it comes to talking about open principles and what we mean by them, and then walking into the nonprofit space and using some of that language, or, even the word transparency, for example. I mean, Transparency International has a very different understanding of transparency than we do in the open org community. And so finding those places where you need to slow down, explain exactly what you mean, maybe use different words, or what you were just saying, acknowledge the fact that some people are already working openly, what we would determine as being working openly, and they just don't call it that at all, or they have like a slight shifts on the methods, or when, from a diversity and inclusion, when culture things, kind of play in. For example, there are cultures that do not turn on the Zoom camera. That's just not a thing. They're there to participate in the conversation, but the Zoom camera is off. That's just not part of how they show up in a meeting. And having understanding for those kinds of things, and still being able to equalize the community contribution opportunity, I guess, and recognition. Those are all. Now we're really nerding out.
Hey, I know we're almost done, but I just wanted to kind of speak in some headlines here. Okay, so I've been really privileged to be an Open Org ambassador, but I haven't been talking out loud because I had to do some heavy lifting in my organization first before I could actually do some work. So I think trying to work with Open Org, open principles, you have to do a lot of work sometimes. And sometimes you have to do some deep work, and that involves listening. So when you're finding your allies, so that's step one, finding your allies. Step two is some deep, meaningful understanding of the culture that you're working in, and thinking about what they mean and what they need and what they say, and how it aligns or how it doesn't align, and then work on the small little fires of, hey, maybe this might work, or maybe not. And I'm not to say that open principles will work in every institution. Maybe they won't, right? I would hope that we could try, but each person needs to use them as a guidepost to go there. So find your allies, get your insights and your examples in your organization, really listen and understand the culture. And then, as you said, Laura, let's work in the open. Just show how it's possible. Like my colleague told me that with the data playbook, she said, when you came in and you said playbook, people were like, what are you talking about, lady? What do you mean collaboration like this? What do you mean you're inviting everybody into the circle? Like, who are you? Whose authority are you? And I'm like, I'm just going to take the authority and make it happen, because I don't think that there needs to be any authorities. Let's just invite you. What happened with that is that now that collaboration method is well known and is being used for other products and services in the house, not related to data at all. Okay. So by working in the open, you can have an impact, and it will take a long time. And so finding your external allies would be my next one. But I think the last one is that to have a lot of patience with yourself and with everybody else, and a lot of respect for the beautiful people out there doing amazing work. And so there's many people in my institution organization who've worked on open things for years and are now just starting to get a lot more credit for it. And so now we're trying to mass it into a shared conversation, and that's even a harder thing. I think, wish me luck. I think that's my next hustle, if you will. But what did I miss from the list, Laura, in terms of tips that we give to people as they're on their journey? And I'd love to hear what their tips are too, by the way. I wouldn't want to be a one-way street here.
Yeah, I would just also, you can comment. I don't know if there's videos. You can comment below, probably.
Yay! Thanks, Jen.
I think, I agree with all of your. The only one that I can think of that you missed is to reach out to other people, to not be afraid to go and tap somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, I've been thinking about this thing, kind of struggling with it, not sure how do I make this work in the world of open? How do I be more open with this situation?
Right.
And actually asking for help. Like, because I was thinking about what you were saying with deep listening. And yes, you absolutely have to listen very deeply when you're going to try and do digital transformation in the nonprofit space, and really understand the mission and what's really going on there with people. Because the missions that these organizations have are so vitally important, that going in just like as if you know everything and then throwing around cookie cutter solutions it's not going to help anything. But the second part of that is to really know when to reach out to the wider community. And I mean, that's something that I've really been quite privileged to have with the open org community, because of my background at Mozilla, because I have been working in this space for so long. When I have gotten frustrated, when I have been not patient with myself, when I've been, not patient with others, I have had a great community of people that I've been able to reach out to. And like Heather, you're one of them. I mean, we've known each other for over a decade, and I remember at MozFest 2011 or whatever, when we started writing books on a Trello board about collaboration, which I still have the Trello board, by the way.
In that hotel room, remember that? I think because we were,
I was just going to say the reason, that we know each other, for example, or other open org ambassadors, that we are able to do the work that we do is because we also reach out for that support. And so don't be afraid to say, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm stuck. I need help. And then finding a person that can help you do that, because that's part of the, that's part of the work, is to know when you need the network.